But I want to begin just by talking about postmodern philosophy in general terms, talking about the general characteristics and themes of postmodern philosophy. I want to start with distinguishing two different understandings of postmodernism. How does postmodernist philosophy connect to what has gone before, and particularly to modernist philosophy? The word itself, postmodernism, implies after modernism, postmodernism. So in what sense is it after modernism? Well, there are two ways we can understand that. First, we can understand postmodernism as a reaction to modernism, What we find in postmodern thinkers is a rejection of the whole modernist project in philosophy, the whole Enlightenment agenda. If you think about the Enlightenment philosophers, the early modern philosophers, they were seeking certain knowledge. They were seeking secure foundations for knowledge. They were trying to discover what is called a final metaphysics, an ultimate understanding of reality. And postmodernists are skeptical about the whole feasibility of that project, of finding certain foundations for knowledge, for finding out the ultimate nature of reality. Postmodernism, in this sense, also rejects some of the ideals of modernism, such as the idea that there are universal norms of reason and morality that apply to everyone, and that any thinking person can discover through rational reflection. That idea of universal norms of reason and morality is challenged by postmodernists as a reaction to modernism. There's also a skeptical reaction to the modern view of science. Postmodernism, in this sense, rejects certain claims about science, that it is objective, that it has authority, and that it is realist, in the sense that scientific theories actually give us information about reality, that when scientific theories describe the world, they're describing the world as the world really is. Modernist philosophers, remember, argued that philosophy needs to be more like science. The problem with philosophy is that it needs to be more like science, more objective, more disciplined in that way, whereas postmodernist philosophers really argue the reverse, that science is actually more like philosophy. Science is much open to interpretation and debate, and it doesn't provide the kind of hard facts and truths that we are looking for. So that's the first understanding of postmodernism. Postmodernism as a reaction to modernism, challenging some of the basic convictions, the basic tenets of modernist philosophy. But secondly, postmodernism can also be seen as an extension of modernism, that is taking modernism even further along the road that it's already set on. What postmodernism does is it pushes that Enlightenment commitment to human autonomy to its ultimate endpoint. Remember, I talked about in the modern period, we see two turns. The subjective turn, the turn towards the subject as the center and the foundation for epistemology, and also the autonomous turn, the turn towards seeing the mind of man, human reason and experience, as the ultimate standard. Well, in this sense, postmodernism pushes that commitment even further, even more consistently, and so it ends up in a position of subjectivism, of relativism, of skepticism about knowledge of any world beyond the human mind, and even nihilism. Nihilism is the ultimate denial of objective goodness, objective truth, and objective meaning. And much of postmodernist philosophy actually pushes human autonomy to the point of nihilism. So that's a general characterization, how we relate postmodernism to modernism in two ways, and I'm not suggesting we choose between these. I suggest that they are both true in different ways. In some respects, postmodernism is a reaction to modernism. In other respects, it is an extension, a continued commitment to modernist principles. Now, we can also talk about some of the characteristics of postmodern philosophy, some of the themes that we often find in these postmodern thinkers. And I've identified 7 here in your outline, which I'm very briefly going to summarize, and we'll see how these develop in the material that follows. First, in postmodern philosophy, we find a reaction to the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth is simply the idea that a thought or a statement is true if it corresponds to the facts, if it corresponds to the way the world really is. And we can trace a correspondence theory of truth all the way back at least to Aristotle, but we also find it in Bertrand Russell and in the early Wittgenstein. And in many respects, it's quite a common sense view of truth. People think that truth, something is true if it corresponds or matches reality, the way things really are. But postmodernists are skeptical of the correspondence theory of truth, and they generally prefer alternative theories of truth, such as the coherence theory of truth or the pragmatist theory of truth. And I will talk a little bit more about those alternative theories of truth a little later on. Secondly, a second characteristic of postmodernist philosophy is that it is against the ideas of universal reason and objective truth. Postmodernists deny that there is any such thing as universal reason, principles of rationality that apply to everyone, everywhere, and we'll see some of the reasons why they deny that. And also they typically reject the idea of objective truth, that there's a truth out there to be discovered, and it's the task of our minds, of the human mind, to discover that truth. You remember the TV series The X-Files. The tagline of that program was, "The truth is out there." And the Agent Mulder character in that series had a poster on the wall of his office that said, "The truth is out there." Well, that's quite a modernist view of truth, actually, or even pre-modern view of truth. But postmodernists are skeptical of the idea that truth is out there independent of our minds, our thoughts, our language about the world. A third characteristic of postmodern philosophy is that it stands against epistemological foundationalism. Epistemological foundationalism. If you remember, we talked about foundationalism, or a particular form of foundationalism, classical foundationalism, when we talked about the philosophies of Descartes and John Locke. The idea is that our knowledge needs foundations. It needs firm foundations that can be located in self-evident truths of reason, or undeniable truths of reason, or immediate facts, observed facts in experience, depending on whether you're a rationalist or an empiricist. But the idea is that there have to be some foundations to ground our knowledge. Postmodernists are skeptical of foundationalist epistemologies, and they will prefer other theories of knowledge, such as the coherence theory of knowledge or contextualist theories of knowledge, neither of which require there to be any foundations anchoring your knowledge in reality. And generally we find among postmodernists anti-epistemological tendencies. That is, they tend to be skeptical about the traditional approach to epistemology, the idea that we can actually analyze knowledge and determine how we know things and what we actually know. They tend to be quite revisionist about epistemology. A fourth characteristic of postmodernist philosophy is a rejection of metaphysical essences, the idea that things have real essences that define what kind of thing they are in an objective way. Think back to the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Plato says that there are these forms, these objective, transcendent forms that define what kinds of things there are in the world. And Aristotle is also a realist about universals and about essences. A substance has a form or an essence that defines what it is. And that's just the way it is, regardless of how we think about it, regardless of how we talk about things. There are essences that actually define what things are. Postmodernists, however, are invariably nominalists. They are nominalists rather than realists about things like universals and essences, and they will say that essences really just reside in our thoughts or our language. That is, things are what they are, not in an objective sense, but because we think of them in a certain way or because we describe them in a certain way. And more broadly, postmodernists, just as they are skeptical of traditional epistemology, they're skeptical of traditional metaphysics as well. We find anti-metaphysical tendencies among postmodernists. They are skeptical of the idea that we can actually determine how things are in themselves, in reality. That leads to the fifth characteristic here in the list, and that is an antipathy towards metaphysical realism. Metaphysical realism. Metaphysical realism is the view that things are the way they are, they exist, and have the characteristics that they do independently of us, independent of the way that we think about them or speak about them. On the contrary, postmodernists are invariably anti-realists. I'll have more to say about that term later on, but according to anti-realism, either we shouldn't speak about reality at all, or when we do speak about reality, we should always say that reality is actually dependent on us. The way things present themselves to us, what we consider to be real, is really dependent on the way that we think about things and the way that we choose to describe things. There are actually anti-realist tendencies, even in someone like Immanuel Kant. If you remember Kant's philosophy, arguably that has the seeds of anti-realism in it, at the very least. But that becomes far more developed and prominent in later postmodernist philosophy. Characteristic number 6, postmodernists are skeptical about objective textual meaning and reference. That is to say, many postmodernists will question the idea that a written text, or indeed even a spoken text, has an objective meaning that is fixed in some way and determined perhaps by the intent of the author or something else. Rather, they will say that the meaning of a text is indeterminate and ultimately only becomes determinate when it is read, when it is interpreted by a reader. And so a text doesn't have a meaning captured in itself, so to speak, that we have the task of figuring out what that meaning is. Rather, we impose meaning upon a text, any text, whether it's the text of the Bible or the text of a novel like Pride and Prejudice or the text of some historical document. We ourselves, as readers, impose or construct a meaning from that text. And they will also be skeptical of the idea that texts and language in general refers to things out there in the world, refers to things beyond language. A common theme among postmodernist thinkers is that language only ever refers to other language. Words refer to words, and round it goes, and words can never refer or be anchored in anything outside of language. There's a kind of circularity. We are caught in our linguistic bubbles, and we can't connect them in any objective way with a world beyond language. These are quite typical postmodernist ideas. And then lastly, number 7, postmodernist philosophy stands against meta-narratives. A meta-narrative is a narrative beyond the narratives. That is, it is a story of stories or a grand story. Often we use the term worldview, and that's very close to what is meant by a meta-narrative. A worldview is an overarching explanation, a story about the way things ultimately are, where everything came from, what is the ultimate meaning of things. Postmodernists will be skeptical, not that people have worldviews, they will accept that people have worldviews, that there are meta-narratives, but they'll be skeptical of the idea that anyone can rationally and objectively validate any particular meta-narrative. There are different meta-narratives, but we cannot stand in a position to say this meta-narrative is true, this meta-narrative is the most rational one, as opposed to all the alternatives. Rather, they will say that each meta-narrative carries its own standards of rationality, its own standards of truth, and there's no objective, transcendent way of determining which meta-narrative through which we interpret the world is valid, is the one that we ought to adopt. So there's a kind of a global relativism packaged up in that claim that we should not think of meta-narratives in a way that are objective and rationally justified or rationally validated. So then we find 7 characteristics of postmodern philosophy. And more broadly, what we find in postmodern philosophy is an overall antipathy toward the classical Western philosophical tradition. That is, that the story of philosophy, the history of philosophy, the way that it is developed, all the way from the ancient Greeks down through the modern period, where you have the standard divisions of metaphysics and epistemology and ethics, and there are certain assumptions that are built into how philosophers are conducting themselves. Postmodernists will take a very revisionist view and say that all these philosophers were really barking up the wrong tree, and we need to rethink what philosophy is all about and what philosophy can actually accomplish. So they don't see themselves as continuing to move in the same direction, to follow the same methodologies of traditional Western philosophy, but rather calling for an entire revolution in the way that philosophers approach their discipline.